Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 22nd of January 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today in the studio, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
Right, we're going to go straight over to the other side of the Atlantic because the US government and particularly Mad Dog Mattis have released the 2018 National Defence Strategy. Well, what a strategy it seems to be, because it seems to be all about attacking Russia and China, Patrick, and not really much about defence. It seems to be pretty aggressive. They're talking about rogue regimes. They're saying that the national defence strategy will rebuild dominance in the defence department, well, they don't mention what China's been up to recently, but they denounced China for using predatory economics to intimidate its neighbours. So this is a pretty aggressive document. Let's have a look at what Jim Mattis said. To those who would threaten America's experiment in democracy, they must know if you challenge us, it will be your longest and worst day. Work with our diplomats. You don't want to fight the Department of Defence. Should we laugh or cry at this, Patrick?
Well, I think that's interesting that he's sort of personalizing the Department of Defense. So he's not saying you don't want to fight the United States, you don't want to fight the U.S. military. He said you don't want to fight the Department of Defense. So this is a man, General James Mattis, who's trying to, it seems to me anyway, Mike, trying to maybe consolidate power into this department. You know, he might be rotated out of that position as is normally the case in the U.S. system. But in terms of changing the way that these agencies and departments and the relationships they have with government, with the elected representatives, with the electorate, that seems to me like a fundamental break in language. I think that's significant in terms of the discourse that's being presented here.
So they said that that the U.S. Allies and partners are going to need to provide greater defence cooperation. Of course, that fits in with the EU military unification narrative.
Interoperability and collective defence themes, yes.
Absolutely. Contribute military capabilities and so on. It said that China and Russia are now undermining the international order from within the system by exploiting its benefits while simultaneously undercutting its principles and rules of the road. Well, we'll come on to that one in a second, but before we do, let's just have a brief look at the military spending compared to other countries around the world. That's quite a spectacular graph, Patrick.
Yeah, what you see there is with all of these countries, I think we have 7 or 8 countries there, I think 8 in total. So the United States total defense budget as it stands, and by the way, that's not the true number, 700 billion, that's underscored a little bit, but just look at that, all of those countries combined is less than the United States' total budget in this, what they call defense. So if you look at the U.S. Defense National Strategy, what does it mean when you look at a document like that? The way it's released, the sort of rhetoric you see in that document, all that is basically, to me, Mike, and it should be viewed to viewers as well as a fundamental sales pitch for an increase in budgets in the following years. That's, to me, it's totally devoid of any real specifics in terms of strategy. It seems to be like it's all abstract threats. There's lots of dangerous things out there. Terrorism, cyber, the Russians, the Chinese, give us as much money as possible so we can upgrade our collapsing U.S. military. Like it's collapsing at $700 billion a year. It's kind of a ridiculous notion that's being put forward. But that's what's in the language there. That's really how ridiculous.
Looking at that graph, Patrick, as you say, compare the United States with all the other countries in the world. In your opinion, does that mean that the United States, does that actually mean that the United States is capable of taking on the rest of the world, or is that representative of inefficiencies within the U.S. defense budget?
Yeah, I think this is what that number you're looking at there, that disparity, that is internal hyperinflation that you see in classic governmental departments that are completely seems safe within the money they think they're going to get allocated each year. So what they do is then the corruption then extends into the contractors who are fulfilling those contracts. I think the NHS and is to a lesser degree an example of that. But if you look at the healthcare system in the United States, Mike, if you look at sort of the amount of corporate money that sort of covers things like Medicaid and Medicare, there's absolute hyperinflation in the U.S. Healthcare system, like you have in the U.S. military. So everybody's doing well on the corporate side, absolutely living high on the hog for decades. And so who pays for that? Well, the public pays for it.
Right, so this is actually a taxpayer bung to the military-industrial complex. Is that what you're saying?
It's not a taxpayer bung because the taxpayer money runs out, Mike, in like March or April. It's a bung to the banks in Wall Street and to central banks that are basically floating the U.S. government's on extended indefinite lines of credit is really what it is. And that's not, that is to some degree a profit center for banks, but if more than anything, Mike, it's a way for the financial institutions to control the state through running up these sort of deficits, because they have to go begging cap in hand every 6 months with the threat of a government shutdown for money from banks. So it is at the end about control. Yes, it's about profit. There are people who cash in along the way, but at the end, it is a system of control.
So $700 billion, sorry, was what was on that graph. But Fortune here is suggesting in 36 months, America will face $1 trillion budget deficit. Well, this is perhaps the reason for it, because Pogo here is saying America's $1 trillion national security budget. So perhaps $1 trillion is more likely the figure.
It is. That is the actual real figure, actually. When they present the $700 billion budget, that is not the full budget. That does include everything from the VA care for veterans all the way to Department of Homeland Security. They sort of parse those budgets out separately, but if you put all into sort of the military and national defense, it's over $1 trillion. Those numbers are well broken down very well by that Pogo document that you just showed there.
Now, here's something that was quite interesting that came out today. Who's on screen here?
This is General James Mattis and Rex Tillerson.
And the quote here is, and it starts with me having breakfast every week with Secretary of State Tillerson, and we talk 2-3 times a day sometimes. We settle all of our issues between he and I, and then we walk together into the White House meetings. That way, state and defense are together. So, you know, we see this disparity between what the Department of Defense and, to a greater or lesser extent, the Department of State are doing on one side, saying and doing on one side, and what Trump is saying on the other side. Is this an indication of where the division is within the administration?
Certainly in the last administration, that's where it seemed to me like a division was between John Kerry and the Ash Carter, who was the Secretary of Defense. So they seem to be saying one thing in terms of policy in Syria, for instance, statements, completely diverging statements from one day to the next. So there seemed to be a bit of a battle there. And you might look at this and say, oh, that's a good thing that the Department of Defense and the Secretary of State are on the same page. But if you look at it in terms of government, that's not exactly how the government is meant to be. It's not meant to be designed so you have this total solidarity between the Department of Defense, which is really military planning. They don't execute operations. That's the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Pentagon and the White House. So it's a strange sort of consolidation of a purpose, dare I say, common purpose. This sort of fusing whole bits of government together so everybody's always on the same page. This seems to me like it's going down a strange kind of road. This is unusual, to me anyway, for the United States, where there should be healthy adversarial relationships and debate between departments on things like foreign policy and the military's role in executing U.S. foreign policy. So I don't necessarily, that doesn't make me very comfortable to see James Mattis as a, bedfellow of Rex Tillerson. So.
Yeah, well, Lavrov was in New York as this was all taking place, and so he gave a press conference yesterday. He said that the document that we've just been discussing is regrettable, that it's regrettable strategic policy towards Russia and China. Instead of relying on international law, it's relying on confrontational concepts and strategies. He said that Russia is ready for dialogue. He said he wants to discuss military doctrine, just as has been done in the past when military people from both countries were building trust. He said that that there are many people that are capable of understanding that strategic stability should be maintained and all risks to it eliminated. And he said that because that he pointed out that the national security strategy names China as the number one aggressive economic power, followed by Russia. And he said that together with China, that they are imploding the international system from the inside and threatening the post-World War II world order. And of course, this is what Theresa May is constantly banging on about, the rules-based international order that she seeks to protect so much. And she mentions this every time that she criticizes Russia. So he's making the point that that's how Russia and China are viewed. They say that the world order was ostensibly created by the US and its allies after World War II, but in reality, the former Soviet Union contributed greatly to it, and they helped build the United Nations. But apparently, the United Nations is pretty anti-Russia and China at the moment as well. He also pointed out the US role in northern Syria. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. But Patrick, you wanted to highlight some comments from Parag Khanna from the Wall Street Journal. I believe this is from 2011. And he said, we've entered a new Middle Ages, an era that most resembles the pre-Westphalian era of nearly 1,000 years ago. That was a period of history when the East was as powerful, if not more so, than the West. Cities mattered more than nations. Powerful dynasties and trading companies were engines of growth and innovation. Private mercenaries fought in all wars. Religious crusades shaped intercultural relations, and new trade routes over land and sea forged the world's first nearly global economy. That was pretty prescient.
Yeah, that was 2011 from Davos. This is writing for the Wall Street Journal there. So good from Parag Khanna. Very insightful in terms of looking at where the world is at right now. I think in terms of Russia, the important thing in terms of what Sergei Lavrov is saying, what Theresa May is saying about her rules-based international order means that means she, the United States and Israel and France don't have to follow those rules, but those rules apply to everybody else. And so that's really what the post-World War II world order was about. It was a double standard on so many levels. And I think people in the West, certain people got the idea when the Soviet Union collapsed that this would be a unipolar order. So instruments of the Cold War that were put in place after World War II to maintain balance and stability, like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, have now been used in an offensive manner, and then everybody in Europe is sitting there denying it, saying, "Oh, we're not doing this. We're not going over the green line that we promised that we wouldn't go over." Between James Baker and Mikhail Gorbachev in that famous meeting back in the early '90s. So, but they are doing it, and the whole world knows it, and I think that's really the important thing about Sergei Lavrov's comment is the world sees what's going on, the world sees where things are moving, but the world is not included when I say that. The United States and Britain and Western Europe, they don't see it. If some people do see it, they're not talking about it, or they're in denial or trying to preserve the previous reality, the previous narrative. They're still holding on to this. And meanwhile, the world is moving forward, and they're not fooling anybody.
Right. Now, we were talking about this on the Sunday Wire last night. Patrick, fantastic interview with the author of this article on 21st Century Wire, because perhaps this is where some of this Department of Defense money is going. WMD America, Inside the Pentagon's Global Bioweapons Industry, and that's written by Diana Gunura. And we had an interview with her on the programme yesterday. Fantastic article, a long read, but worth the effort.
Sure. So this is basically outlining an investigation into a chain of U.S. bioweapons facilities located offshore and strategically located in the Republic of Georgia, in the Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, basically lining right along the underbelly of Russia. And so this is where all these U.S. bioweapons laboratories, and you could say they do have the ability to manufacture biological agents as well. And they are classified. Employees, even contractors, are given diplomatic immunity. I thought this was an interesting part of the story as well. And this is also coinciding with outbreaks of biological events in some of these countries. Is it a coincidence? Bubonic plague in Kyrgyzstan and other similar toxins and outbreaks in places like Georgia and the Ukraine. Does it have anything to do with these U.S. operations? This is a good question. She's done the investigation, opened it into this subject. It is very controversial, of course, and a lot of people don't want to hear it, but the facts are there in the article, and it's very well referenced.
Full of documentation, as usual.
Official documentation, yes.
Right. What's going on in northern Syria, Patrick?
Well, this is potentially, I'm going to say this is potentially something of big concern. What we're seeing here in northern Syria is the potential of another front, an actual war breaking out, an interstate war breaking out. Turkey has attacked the Afrin province of northern Syria. This is threatening to spread further, in fact, and it will very quickly. But the Turkish ex-foreign minister, is blaming this on the U.S.'s statement that it was going to stop arming the Kurds, instead announcing a few weeks ago that it's going to be training a 30,000-strong border force to somehow reinforce and maintain the border between northern Syria and Turkey with a Kurdish proxy army, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are basically the YPG. The U.S. just bought some new patches to stick on their uniforms with a fancy brand called the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is so American, it's ridiculous. Why is America in Syria? Well, they're there illegally against international law. And I think Moscow just announced, Mike, on the wires this morning, that if the U.S. is going to continue being in Syria, they're going to have to ask Damascus for permission. This is breaking news today. That's
quite a difference in strategy.
It is.
And this potentially puts the U.S. and Russia up against each other?
This does put the U.S. and Russia directly up against each other. It puts the U.S. and everybody directly up against each other, because before this, Mike, the policy was sort of hands-off because nobody wanted to poke the U.S. Because the U.S. would use Israeli logic and say, well, we have to defend ourselves, even though they're illegally in someone's country, and then use that as a sort of pretext to strike back. Not only that, you have a situation where Turkey, a NATO member, might be attacking U.S.-backed, another NATO member's backed proxy forces in the YPG/SDF Kurdish militia over there on the northeastern side of Syria. So that is NATO on NATO indirectly. But still, this could also affect Turkey's membership in NATO. There could be a crisis. I don't know. But a lot of things can go wrong here. Not only that, Turkey is employing jihadi terrorist fighters from the Free Syrian Army, which, according to, not to steal the phrase from analyst Mark Sloboda from the Sunday Wire yesterday, but the Free Turkish Army, he's calling it now. So it's just there's a lot of things that can go wrong here, Mike. A lot of things.
Good news, Patrick, because Matthew Rycroft is, of course, no longer permanent representative to the United Nations for the United Kingdom. But not so good news I've still got him labelled as permanent representative to the UNSC there, but not so good news as he is today become our new permanent secretary to the Department for International Development. And Penny Mordaunt, who's of course Secretary of State, said it's fantastic to have Matthew starting as DFID's new permanent secretary today. He brings to the role a deep dedication to international development, a truly global perspective, an understanding of how Britain's security and prosperity depends upon our aid commitment. Matthew Rycroft said, I'm delighted to be joining DFID as your permanent secretary at this important time. DFID has a fantastic reputation and a crucial mission to support terrorism. Oh, that's a typo, Patrick. That's a typo.
To support terrorism.
No. In fact, what he said was to eradicate poverty. Yes. Look, I'm sorry. That is a typo.
That's a typo.
I'm sorry, but
retract it.
It is retracted. It is retracted. That's not what he said. He said to eradicate poverty. I'm sorry, I have not seen Department for International Development money eradicating poverty anywhere. What I have seen is Department for International Development money being pumped into areas where terrorists are active. And in fact, if we look at any of the main areas where DFID aid money is going, these are areas that are suffering some form of insurgency, like Boko Haram, like Syria, like a whole bunch of
Myanmar.
Well, for example, yes, all these places are experiencing some kind of insurgency. So that typo, perhaps some kind of Freudian slip there, and I do apologise for it, of course. But I think there's some justification to it.
Well, I must say, Matthew Rycroft has done an absolutely horrible job as the UN ambassador to Britain. And it was embarrassing to watch some of his tag teaming with Samantha Power and Nikki Haley in the UN. It really, and from a diplomatic point of view, it's just, what can you say? You can't get any worse than that. I can't imagine who's going to be following him in that position. Hopefully somebody better.
Yeah. Now, the Express, I'm glad to see catching up slightly. Well, rather, it's... the first thing to note here is the headline. It says, Britain at risk of being dragged into EU Defence Force, says former Royal Marines chief. And the subhead says a retired, and the word retired is in capitals, so they want to emphasise that he's retired. He's not serving, but nonetheless, this is Major General Julian Thompson, who was a Royal Marines commander during the Falklands conflict, and he was speaking to the Daily Express about three aspects of the deal that was done between Theresa May and French President Macron at Sandhurst last week. And he's concerned that these threaten to pull Britain into a Brussels-run military force. I'm glad he's speaking out about it because, of course, UK Column has been speaking out about it for several years. It says here, his warning comes after the European Commission confirmed that Hawks Associates has become the first British company to be involved in the European Defence Fund. He is also chairman of the Pro-Brexit Veterans for Britain, and he highlighted, they say, concerns over the Anglo-French deal for Britain to engage with the controversial European Defence Fund. He said UK involvement in these programmes would bind the UK to collective decision-making in several other respects of defence policy, and participation itself is heavily controlled by the EU Commission. Participation would be entirely counterproductive for the UK and UK defence industry. And he said criteria for participation are already clearly mapped out, and the UK has been unwisely agreeing to these criteria without parliamentary consent ahead of the Brexit departure agreement. It is nonsense to allege that participation criteria is somehow still in formation, or that the UK isn't already signed up, and that the UK would benefit from participation, or the entangling commitments it requires. Well, that's all true, except that it's any suggestion that this is unwise, I think, is missing the point. This isn't about being wise or unwise. This is policy.
This is policy. Whether you like it or not, this is a reality. And so we need to start talking about what it really means. And if Britain is going to be working with the new EU Defence Force, which by all indications, Mike, this is what PESCO has laid the framework for. Then once you engage in that collective act of defense, then you no longer have an independent foreign policy. So what we're going to have is Westminster saying, this is our foreign policy, but then joining up in joint military actions and performing things that are possibly contravene what's being said by politicians. So total schizophrenia, total dysfunction. This is what you would be looking at potentially in the future. But this looks like it's going ahead, Mike, and there doesn't look like anybody who is going to stop it. So it is great to see some people raising these questions, like this gentleman you've highlighted here. But until anybody in the body politic gives it any serious consideration, I don't think they're just going to gradually keep nudging their way into this new world.
Right. Davos starts tomorrow, Patrick. The World Economic Forum meeting at Davos starts tomorrow. And of course, one of the big talking points is going to be global warming.
Of course.
So it's perhaps unfortunate that the roads to Davos are blocked because of a huge snowstorm in the Alps.
That's a shame.
So obviously, global warming at work.
Yeah. And Al Gore was one of the keynote speakers too. So
well, I'm sure he's already there, but.
Yeah,
but who knows? Who knows? Maybe
this is the ultimate Philistine talking shop for globalists, Davos. So what have they done for the world since they've gotten together in the 80s? How many financial crashes have we had, and derivatives bubbles, and all sorts of fraud?
The biggies are on the way.
They always get together every year to figure out how they're going to figure the next crash for this year. So.
Well, yeah, but what are they going to be discussing this year? They're going to be discussing democracy in a post-truth era. So this meeting is going to be all about the fake news agenda and what can be done about it. Now, this is pretty interesting and pretty timely because one of the things that happened as a result of the meeting at the weekend was that Theresa May has made a comment, or has actually taken some action, but we're going to come on to that in a second. First of all, we'll just remind everybody that, of course, French President Macron used his annual New Year's press conference to propose a new law to deal with fake news and the spread of disinformation online, as he described it. His goal was to sort of put an end to this issue of fake news through the law. And he said that by the end of 2018, he would be introducing a bill to crack down on anybody spreading disinformation, misinformation, whatever he chooses to call it. Now, the point is that just like in Britain, France already has laws which prevent publication of or broadcasting any kind of what they describe as disinformation in bad faith. They have Article 27 of the Press Law 1881, which puts currently a fine of €45,000 on anybody who disseminates false information by whatever means. So that includes the internet. Now, apparently that's not good enough, so he wants to do something about it. But of course, it's not just France and Germany. As we know, we've had this recent law, which is the NetzDG law, which has come into force on the 1st of January this year, which requires social networks like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube to remove illegal content, or they could face pretty heavy fines, up to €50 million in that case, if they don't actively censor people that are on their platforms. Italy's government has just published this website today, and this website is designed to allow people to notify the government of content, fake news content online, and they will then do something about it. I'm not clear exactly what it is they're going to do about it, but nonetheless, they're encouraging ordinary people to get involved with the campaign against fake news and report any fake news they see online. Well, here's what Theresa May has done about it, because she has decided that the government communication services are going to be put. This is a unit which is based within the Cabinet Office at the moment. Perhaps in the not too distant future it'll be spun out into some kind of mutual or something, but at the moment it's within the Cabinet Office. And they're going to monitor social media to, quote, identify and challenge disinformation.
Right.
So this is a government agency or a government unit within the Cabinet Office which is going to be watching social media. They say that the civil service needs to build a rapid response team, a rapid response social media capability to deal quickly with disinformation and reclaim a fact-based public debate.
Oh, okay.
So she's going to authorize the creation of this unit. Well, this is, what is this now?
Great
Patrick?
A great brainstorm. Oh, go back to that image. So who are these two ladies here? Are they working in the government's communication service? Or is this just a stock photo they got off a stock photo website?
I think that's probably, so you're suggesting it's fake news?
It could be fake news. This could be disinformation or distorting reality. Or are these people actually working in this government department here? I don't know. They certainly look nice, though. Very pleasant.
I don't think so. But look, what are we looking at here? We're now looking at active government censorship. What we're clearly seeing across governments right across Europe now is a major concern that they've lost control of the narrative. The mainstream media isn't doing their jobs, and it looks like governments are having to step in.
Well, the problem is the mainstream media is the #1 source of disinformation and fake news by orders of magnitude. So who decides what's disinformation? How would the government know if something's disinformation? We can throw you dozens of stories. We read off some last night about sort of major fake news stories to do with Donald Trump by CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post. These are some of the biggest media outlets in the world, and BuzzFeed, which is a subsidiary effectively by investment of NBC International, another multinational conglomerate. So they're putting out fake stories, totally fabricated reports, scaring the public, misinforming the public. Are they going to be pulled up by any of these rapid response teams? So this line, Mike, between Facebook, between Silicon Valley and government, where the government barks and the Silicon Valley removes the information. Is this any better than Mussolini's Italy in terms of the powers the state had in that country for censorship, in a fascist dictatorship? It's no different. The only difference is the technology, Mike.
Yeah. Well, back in November, Demos published the fake news toolkit, and they're arguing that it's vital that I'm not sure who we is that Demos or is that the neoliberal elite? Or not quite.
That's the neoliberal intelligentsia who knows best for everybody.
Yeah, so it's vital that we seek bottom-up solutions for separating the signals from the noise on social media, rather than looking just to governments and internet companies to police users. So what they're saying then is that it may not be sufficient. We've got to take an approach from every direction, every possible direction to deal with this problem. They are absolutely panicking about it. So that was back in November. Today, Demos and the Internet Watch Foundation have published a report basically saying, among other things, that children should be taught about the dangers of online sexual content, that schools need to do more to teach children about the dangers of sharing sexual content online, because a small proportion of children are getting involved in sexting and getting involved in putting this material online themselves. And because a small proportion of children are doing it, you've got to then bring the subject to a much wider audience and make sure that all children know how to do it. Is that what's going on?
Normalizing or exposing as many children as you can to the deviant behavior
of a few.
In effect, normalizing it. And in terms of the young children, why isn't anybody asking the question, why does a 7, 8, or 9-year-old or 10-year-old or even 11 and 12-year-old require a smartphone and be able to have that at school every day? Will they survive without one? Can they live without one? Can they have just a normal mobile phone to make phone calls and communicate with their parents if that's the concern? Why isn't that question being asked?
Well, in fairness to this report, they do make that point. But the other thing that they say is they're concerned about the rise of the Internet of Things, because that potentially means that pedophiles are able to put child abuse images on so-called smart devices, because these things are being put on the internet in huge numbers. They've been talking about fridges for years. I don't know how many fridges there are out there that are internet enabled, but certainly we're seeing lots of devices, cameras and other devices being put on the internet with very poor security, and some of these devices have a small amount of storage attached to them. Internally.
So they're talking about stashing kiddie porn in your toaster.
That's exactly right.
This is
That's
not
exactly
good.
Right. So no, well, it's not good. But on the other hand, is this really a likely scenario that we're going to find this happening, or is this just more? I get the feeling that there's a concern that the internet is now becoming, or has become, something that the government didn't quite envisage.
A problem.
It's a problem that has to be dealt with. So we've got to demonize the internet. It's quite an interesting thing. Maybe I'm being overly cynical about that.
I think you're absolutely on the money there.
Right. Let's move on to Brexit, and this is from Brexit Central, and I'm afraid I have to criticise this article heavily. The headline is "The House of Lords has no right to stop the EU withdrawal bill." This is written by Brendan Bolton, who's a Labour councillor from Kent, former parliamentary candidate, and he was head of the Labour Leave campaign. And what he's saying is the European Union withdrawal bill will shortly proceed to the House of Lords, where the Remain-dominated chamber is expected to challenge virtually every line of the legislation. The House of Lords fulfills an important constitutional legislative responsibility to check, amend and seek to improve bills arriving from the Commons. Typically the upper chamber does this competently and serve this nation well, but he goes on to argue that in this case they won't. This is an attack on the House of Lords, of course, but fundamentally what it doesn't do is with any rationality, consider the implications of the EU withdrawal bill, which of course has got nothing whatever to do with withdrawal from the EU. Yes, this is what was formerly called the Great Repeal Bill. So yes, it does repeal one piece of legislation, which is the 1974 European Communities Act. That's a good thing. But the rest of it is based on the notion, as we've said many times, that the entire body of EU law gets placed onto the British statute books, and that means that on the day that we leave the EU, that Britain's law is absolutely lockstep in sync with the European Union's. And there's no criticism. There's plenty of criticism of what might happen in the House of Lords should they attempt to comment on every line of the bill and try to stop this bill in its present form. There's no comment in this article about what this bill is and what it actually represents. And I think it's about time that many Brexit campaigners started to look at the bigger picture here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the people, if you look at the talking points that are being drifted out last week, Nigel Farage again says, oh, there's a possibility that we might not be leaving Europe. And then we see other set of talking points drifted out on the Daily Telegraph couple of days ago saying that, well, we should be able to rejoin the EU after the toxicity of the debate calms down a little bit and be able to quietly rejoin the EU. So in other words, the framework is still in place. And so whether we officially stay or go in the short term doesn't really matter because the framework's in place. And by that, you can infer that the UK Britain will be rejoining the EU or will be a part of a new Europe anyway. So this, again, is just Punch and Judy.
Yeah. Now, we've mentioned Eugene Lukyanenko a couple of times over the last few weeks. This is day 60 of his hunger strike. If you remember, this is the Ukrainian-Russian concert pianist who is currently in prison. But he was trying to protest against the fact that his son had been removed from his care by social services on the basis that the boy's grandfather, his father, had survived the Holocaust, and that therefore that Eugene's son was at risk from some kind of emotional harm as a result of that. This was a spectacular decision by a family court judge. Well, I'm glad to see that John Hemming, former Liberal Democrat MP, long-time campaigner, lots could be said about John Hemming, but in this case, I'm glad to see that he has brought this case into the Daily Mail because it's about time that it got into the mainstream press. Having said that, the Daily Mail has not published Eugene Lukyanenko's name. They don't want to publish his name. They've said in the body of the article that the boy's name cannot be published, and that, of course, that should be the case, but they refuse to name him either. They simply say a family court judge must explain why a concert pianist has been jailed, campaigners say.
Why can't they name him?
That's not that they can't, that they won't.
Why?
Well, they may
don't want to give him publicity because he'll get public support, right?
They may feel that there may be a little bit of that. They may certainly that seems to have been a decision, that appears to be a decision of the legal department more than anything else. They just say the man who was living in Kent has been embroiled in a long-running family court dispute with social services staff at Medway Council over the care of his teenage son. Detail of the dispute has emerged in rulings published on legal websites in recent years following private family court hearings. Judges have heard how the man has been caring for his son since early 2015. The boy was taken from their home after social workers raised concerns about his home life. This was all about the grandfather and this bogus allegation of emotional harm. But at least, as I say, it's getting some coverage.
This is interesting. So the mother died. The mother died a couple of years ago, right? The child's mother.
That I don't know off the top of my head.
Well, I think he's lost his mother,
right.
Possibly. Wow, amazing.
Right. The Independent, thanks to the person in the UK Column Forums who posted this. The Independent here has, what is an exclusive, because this headline is Home Office faces inquiry after police storing 20 million mugshots, including images of innocent people. So they say ministers face a parliamentary inquiry over the storing by police of 20 million mugshots after a senior MP warned the practice raises fundamental civil liberty issues. And so the Norman Lamb, who's the chairman of the Commons Science and Technology Committee, has said to the Independent that his committee is ready to investigate. This is quite interesting, Patrick, because it's nearly 6 years since the High Court ruled that this storage of these facial images was unlawful in this country. And the government has been promising since then to bring forward legislation, and they never have. Now, what were the government actually promising to do? They were promising to bring in legislation which would make the past unlawful behaviour. Of course, you cannot bring in retrospective legislation this way to make something which was illegal legal. That isn't really possible. The High Court said that there was a risk of stigmatisation of those entitled to the presumption of innocence. But at the end of the day, Pat, what's this about? It's about facial recognition. It's about creating a big data set for the development of facial recognition systems. Now, I think it was 3-4 months ago that Ian R. Crane had Pippa King, long-standing biometrics campaigner, on Humanity versus Insanity, and she had been invited to have a look at one of the police's facial recognition systems on the sidelines of a public demonstration. And she said that it actually wasn't hugely impressive at this point. I suspect that the reason that the government hasn't brought forward any legislation is they know they couldn't possibly get it passed. But they feel that the police require this large data set. And in the meantime, they're hoping that this just sails under the radar and there isn't too much public awareness of it. That has to change. And we're going to end on this one, Patrick. Andrew Mitchell.
Here he is. Andrew Mitchell of Department of International Development fame, I think.
Yes.
So he and a few other Tory grandees, including the wonderful Peter Lilly, caught up in this potential sting here.
Another Chinese sting.
Another Chinese sting. Fu Lu, I think the name was the damsel in distress in this story. But this sort of came out as a Daily Mail story, and apparently Mr. Mitchell knew something was dodgy in advance when he got the email that looked like one of those Nigerian scam emails. It was so obvious. But apparently, there's still some appetite for this sort of thing in Westminster. Some of these politicians still attending these meetings, Mike, even though they might say afterwards, some of them, that, I knew it was a scam, and so forth. But certainly Jack Straw and Malcolm Rifkin and a lot of interesting characters have been lured in the past for promises of thousands in consultancy fees. In this case, it was to help China maximize on opportunities related to Brexit. So,
oh, really?
Yes, right. Interesting.
So just if I understand what you've said there, he seems to be claiming that he suspected something was wrong, but he went to the meeting anyway.
Well, it's not clear whether he went to the meeting in this article. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure if he attended or not.
Right.
But apparently he's a smart cookie, old Andrew Mitchell. He knew something was up from the get-go. So you got to get up early to fool this guy if you're the Daily Mail or any of the tabloids.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you very much for joining us, Patrick. Thank you for joining us. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. If you like what we're doing, we do need your support. Please consider taking out a membership. It does help us a lot, and we want to expand this year. We will be back, as I say, tomorrow at 1 p.m. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.